Good afternoon, everyone. So, we've come to Winter Light in our film series. Many of you, I think, have been here before, but for those of you who have not been here before, my name is Linda Rugg. I'm a professor in the Scandinavian department at UC Berkeley, and I'm teaching my undergraduate course in the films of Ingmar Bergman this semester, and it's a special edition of that course because this is the 100th anniversary of Ingmar Bergman's birth. And so there's a lot of celebrations all over the world, including here at the PFA. And so our course was made part of the series that is also open to the public. So this is a hybrid audience consisting of undergraduates and members of the public. The way that we run the course, for those who haven't been here, is that I'm going to do a short introduction of the film, and then we'll watch the film together. This one is a short film, and it won't seem very short, though. And yeah. And then afterwards, we'll have an opportunity for discussion. I'm going to give my students a few minutes to pack up and leave after the film is over, and then we'll regroup around discussion. If you're in my Ollie course, which I'm also teaching alongside this, you're also free to leave. We're going to talk about the film in class tomorrow. Okay, and also please remember to silence your cell phones because we did have one problem one time about that. So please do that. Okay. So I realized when I read over my introduction to this film today that I made it sound really, really dark. And it is pretty dark, actually. But I like this film very much, despite its darkness. It's very beautiful. So the English title of this film, Winter Light, it's evocative of a mood. And certainly the dominant feeling of this film is winteriness or darkness, because in Sweden, that's the dark time of the year. This is the first Bergman film of this series that was not shot in the summer. Last week's film, The Virgin Spring, they began to shoot it in late spring, early summer, when you can still have rogue snowstorms in that part of Sweden, Dalarna, where it was filmed. And if you saw last week's film, you might have been struck by how the film begins with this beautiful summer day, spring day, and then it turns cold and the snow starts to fall. Okay, but Winter Light is covered from the beginning in this crusty and dirty snow of late winter when everyone's tired of the season and the snow is no longer magical. It's just something that you have to slog through day after day. The people in the film have colds and the flu. They huddle miserably in the old cold church, still wrapped in their coats and their scarves and their hands in gloves. So the English title, Winter Light, is not an inaccurate title, but it is a mistranslation. The Swedish title is Nattvardsgästerna, which is correctly translated in the British release title. So the American release would sometimes have a different name from the British release. The British release title was The Communicants. The idea of communicants is maybe a little unfamiliar to some Americans. It refers to the people who take communion during a church service who belong to a particular congregation. So she is a communicant in the Church of St. Thomas, you could say, meaning that she's a member of that church. She takes communion there. We might be more familiar with the opposite term, which is excommunicate. Someone who is excommunicated is exiled from the community and no longer is able to take communion specifically. So in English, the title Communicants kind of becomes ironic because the people of this film, though they are members of the same parish and they do take communion in the first part of the film, they go all the way through the communion service in the film. These people are members of the same parish, but they have a deep sense of not belonging and not communicating. So in the opening scene, they take communion together, but they could not be more far apart from one another. The Swedish title, to stay with the idea of language for a little bit longer, and language is important because Bergman is a writer. The Swedish title is Communicants, but the literal meaning of the word nattvardsgästerna is closer to guests at the Last Supper. That's how they say communicant in Swedish. And that seems closer to the meaning of the film because if you recall, some of you may recall, the scene at the table at the Last Supper, you remember that Jesus announces that he's going to be killed and that someone's going to betray him. And so the mood at the original communion table is despair, confusion, suspicion, and the sense that the world is ending. As many of you probably know, Ingmar Bergman's father, Erik, was a Lutheran pastor, an important pastor serving the Swedish royal court. And as a child, Bergman spent many hours in a church and was a communicant of Hedvig Eleonora Church in Stockholm, which is not far from the Royal Dramatic Theatre, where he would work as an adult. The story of Winter Light began with a short piece that Bergman crafted about an existential crisis. And it's a little hard to figure out what he's doing here. He's actually writing notes in a notebook that he used to base his film stories on. So some of these are very fluid and sort of dreamlike. And so what he says in this note is an I figure, and by this I think he means a dreamlike image of himself. An I figure goes into a desolate church to speak to God. So, and that's the very first sentence. And then as we follow this notebook passage that follows this, the I figure shifts back and forth between an I and a he. And it shifts back between wrestling with God and walking away, between releasing himself from guilt and continuing to confront guilt and God. And this is a longer quote from that passage. He writes, I go into the church, lock the door, and stand there in a fever. I wait for the miracle that is like drinking from the breast of a woman. This is what he writes. Blasphemy, contempt, hate that knows no bounds. That's the next sentence. He approaches the church altar. So now he shifted from I to he. He approaches the church altar. The despairing silences of the night, the graves, the dead, and the rats, the smell of death and putrefaction, the hourglass, the terror that comes with night. The bottom is reached. Gethsemane. So Gethsemane is the garden where Jesus was praying when he's betrayed by Judas. The crucifixion. And now he switches back to I, and he says, I leave my path. I leave my path. I leave the way. I go away from all of this that is already old and that I do not want to contemplate any longer. From here out, I am probably free to go. But the guilt, I cross it out. I do not leave the church until I have my answer, and however things go, I will stay here. And that's the end of the quote. So I think that there's a way in which we can identify this original quote of Bergman's with the figure of the pastor, the main figure in the film. The pastor in the film is named Thomas Eriksson. As those of you who know the Bible will recognize, Thomas was a disciple who was not present when Jesus appeared after his death to the other disciples. And Thomas expresses doubt that Jesus has risen from the dead. So Jesus returns and lets Thomas see and touch his wounds. Jesus then says, Thomas, you believed because you have seen me. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. This is the origin of the phrase doubting Thomas. And in the film, we see how deeply the pastor doubts. So he's definitely a doubting Thomas who is looking, and is very much like the knight in the Seventh Seal who's looking for evidence of God's presence. Thomas Eriksson's last name, Eriksson, could refer to Bergman himself because he was the son of Erik Bergman. But the pastor could also be Erik Bergman, if we want to go down a biological route. His father had retired. Okay, so this is a story that Bergman tells about his father that's important to this narrative. And the two of them were traveling on a Sunday in the winter. They stopped at a little church north of Uppsala for worship. Uppsala's a little northwest of Stockholm. There were only 4 people sitting in the pews on the Sunday morning. The rector and the usher seemed agitated, as did the organist and the music director. There were 4 people in the pews and 4 people working at the church. The priest was nowhere to be seen. The Swedes call their pastors priests. Yeah. The priest was nowhere to be seen, even as the bells sounded for the service. He arrived late. This is, okay, in Sweden, this is not okay. Okay. So they have something that they call den svenska punktligheten, which means the Swedish punctuality, and you do not arrive late, especially for important things. He arrived late and rushed into the church. He went up to the communion rail and faced the congregation. He explained, I have a fever. I'm sick. I'm going to hold a short service today. I'm not going to have communion. And when he went back to put on his robe behind the altar in the sacristy, Bergman's father got up angrily and said, I'm going to talk to that guy. So Bergman's father walked up to the priest, leaning heavily on his cane. He was elderly. After a few minutes, the pastor came back out and explained that there would be communion after all, and that an older colleague would help him. Bergman's father would help him. For Bergman, this was a codification of an unwritten law. And this is a quote from Bergman, you must always hold your service. Okay. You must always hold your service. As you may have gathered, this is no entertaining piece. Gunnar Björnstrand, who plays Thomas Eriksson, who had become famous in Sweden during the 50s for his comic roles, he was beloved as a comic actor, was asked to play a deeply unsympathetic and unattractive man. Björnstrand suffered and had health problems throughout the shooting, but Bergman thought that these health problems were useful. It's great that he looks so haggard, he said. Ingrid Thulin, who played Marianne in Wild Strawberries, she plays the daughter-in-law of Isak in Wild Strawberries, also plays a thoroughly unglamorous woman and is asked to produce one of the most difficult monologues in Bergman's film work. She does an amazing job of it, but it's not easy to listen to or to watch, and it certainly was not easy to produce. Sven Nykvist was the cameraman, and his work on the lighting and the shooting of this film is nothing short of miraculous. And then there is a small role played by Alan Edwall. I mentioned him last time. He was the monk in the Virgin Spring, and here too he has a very important small role. He plays the custodian of the church, that he has a speech that makes up a defining moment in the film. And Bergman says, this character is an angel. So that's how you're supposed to see his character, that he is an angel. The film received very mixed reviews in Sweden, but it did manage to excite a theological debate. In America, people were mostly puzzled. One of the reviews was titled, "Wake up, Ingmar." But Woody Allen recreates Ingrid Thulin's tortured monologue in his film Stardust Memories. And there was a recent film that came out by Paul Schrader called First Reform that basically restages part of this film. So if you've seen First Reform, you will recognize it here. Winter Light is the second film in what Bergman later called his God trilogy. The films were not conceived as a trilogy in the beginning, but Bergman argues, at least in one interview, that they belong together. The first of these is Through a Glass Darkly, which we're not watching in this series, in which a mentally ill young woman believes that she's communicating with a spider god. Winter Light, as you have gathered, deals extensively with faith and the lack of it. Next week's film is the third film of the trilogy, The Silence, and it does not seem to mention God at all, but we can think about that for next time. This time we're going to focus on the light of winter as it comes through the windows of a small medieval Swedish church. Thank you. We'll watch the film. Okay, we have a couple of microphones, so those of you who have been here before may recall that because this is being recorded, and also because I need to be able to hear people, you need to wait for the microphone before you should speak. I have someone there, I have someone right there. We can get started.
This is done in 63?
Oh, I'm sorry. You have to hold it up to your mouth and make sure it's on.
This is written in 63?
I don't think it's on. Is it on? Can you check? Is that okay?
This is written in 63?
Yes, 1963. She asked me if it was written. I can't. I don't know if it was written in 63, but it was produced in 63. All right, go ahead.
This film reminds me so much of The Diary of a Country Priest.
Were you thinking that one too? Diary, yes.
Yeah, Bresson, I think. In what way might this film have been influenced or be in response to that film?
I don't know the background to that. But they have been compared to each other. You mean whether or not Bergman saw this as a response to that? Certainly they're along the very, very same lines. Diary of a Country Priest is also, I believe, based on a book. And Bergman wrote this one himself. But they do follow along the same lines about doubt and a sort of existential doubt that the priest has, right? But I'm not sure about the actual line of influence. It would be interesting to look that up and see. Yeah, thank you. Okay, other people? I have somebody there. Yeah, we have to pass it down the line. Yeah. These microphones are not our friends right now. Okay.
Yes. At these other screenings, you've talked about masks, and this film, I feel, has like Bergman taking a decided take on love. In this film and the film that precedes it that we didn't watch, there's this question of, are love and God synonymous?
Yeah.
And I feel like in this one, Bergman's perspective is that for him they are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if you agree and if you feel that this is sort of Bergman shedding his own mask or sort of speaking on a subject that his father dealt with.
It's hard in this. Okay, so one of the things that I sort of introduced this idea is like, well, maybe the pastor is Bergman himself, maybe the pastor is his father. It's not. There's clearly a moment of identification between Bergman and the pastor figure in some way, but also identifying the pastor figure with his father. And it's a little hard to actually position what the argument of the film turns out to be, because you have these different people within the frame of the film. And I'm not sure that we come to a conclusion about God being love, but one of the things that I think does seem to come through, because it's repeated and it happens, one of the things that does come through is, what is suffering? What was the true suffering of Christ? So that's the speech that I mentioned before, that the custodian has, the one who has the deformity, by Alman Edval. And he asks, he sits down and talks to Thomas about, the true suffering of Christ couldn't have just been physical. And Thomas is suffering physically throughout the film. He's coughing, he's got a fever, he's, dealing with this whole physical problem throughout the film. And he says it couldn't possibly be physical suffering, because the suffering, and the audience laughs, I think the suffering wasn't that bad. So there are all these images of Jesus and being tortured, and those are sort of prominently displayed throughout the church, right? And so one of the messages that the church puts forward is precisely this suffering of the crucifixion. But what the custodian says is, it was because he felt he was alone. Everyone betrayed him, and he also doubted that everything that he had taught. In the end, he thought God had turned away from him, and he doubted everything that he had taught. And he said, it's God's silence, right? And so, of course, the audience is like, oh yeah, we heard about God's silence earlier. So what's interesting about that scene is the way in which this custodian, who's actually kind of a pest as far as the pastor is concerned. The pastor is just like, this guy is one of these people who won't leave me alone, and he's kind of hanging on. And then he sits down and tells Thomas his truth. It's God's silence. So I think that if there's something that gets or sort of validated in the film, it may it may be that, it may be this idea that true suffering is the lack of faith and also solitude. And that's also, if you think back to Wild Strawberries, if you saw Wild Strawberries and the scene in which Isaac Borg fails his examination, he's deemed incompetent, after he has that examination in his nightmare, and then he asks, "What's my punishment going to be?" And the examiner says, "Well, I guess the usual, loneliness." So, to get back to your question about love, or whether God is love, I think that this lack of connection is the opposite of God, right? This idea that this solitude, this aloneness, this feeling of being betrayed, the feeling of being alone, that is the sort of polar opposite of love, certainly, and potentially also the opposite of having faith or relationship. And in Christianity, the relationship is imagined as a relationship to God, but Marta, Ingrid Tulin's character, when she's talking about the communion, do you remember? He says, "Why did you take communion?" Because he knows she's not a believer. She's made that very clear. She doesn't believe in God. She just comes to the service sort of, to be with him. And she sort of makes fun of it, and she goes, "Well, it's a love feast, isn't it?" And that's what the communion was supposed to be. That's the designation of what communion is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a love feast, not an orgy, but a sort of a transcendent feast of love for the people who participate. So there's a way in which the film moves the sacred over into the secular, right? A community of people who love each other, or people who love each other. That's maybe the meaning, and that gets at what you're asking, I think. Yeah. I have someone there. I have someone here. I have someone there. I have quite a few people.
I have a question about the Virgin Spring.
Yeah.
It bothered me in terms of the attitude of the family toward the servant girl after the murder is committed. They don't come down on her. They don't criticize her.
No.
They're not mad at her when it might be expected, because she has failed to protect the young woman,
Right.
and doesn't even try to intervene, even though that may not have been successful. She puts the rock down instead of throwing it.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering why they're not mad at her, why they don't come down on her.
So this is the film that we watched last week, and I think quite a few of you were here, but maybe not everyone was here. But there's a scene in which a young woman is raped and murdered, and there's another young woman who has a lower standing in the family, who's a servant of the family, who accompanies the young woman who's raped and murdered, and she is a bystander. She watches. Not only does she watch as this young woman is raped and murdered, but she actually wished that the young woman would be raped and murdered, and subsequently she confesses. That's an important word. She confesses that she wished for this death, right? And confession is an opportunity for forgiveness in a Christian context, right? So one of the things that I said was that this film kind of oscillates. That's The Virgin Spring, the last film we watched. It oscillates between paganism and Christian belief. And I think that the family's forgiveness of this woman, this young girl, is a practice of Christian forgiveness. I think that that's true. I think that that's what's happening. It precedes him actually going and killing those guys, though. So there's not a clear path from paganism to Christianity, but rather a sort of a pendular motion. That when she confesses her wrongdoing, not only she confesses, but the mother confesses later on and says, "I shouldn't have loved my daughter so much, and I shouldn't have spoiled her, and I shouldn't have treasured her above all things, and that's why she died. That's why she had to die." And the father says, "There's guilt enough to go around for everyone." So the father's forgiveness Okay, so in the Lord's Prayer, which was recited here for us today, we got to see like the whole church service from the communion all the way to the bitter end, right? So we got to see the whole thing, right? But the Lord's Prayer is recited, right? And it's like, what the line is, forgive us our debts, is what they say in Swedish. Forgive our debts as we forgive those who are indebted to us, right? So that you're supposed to forgive other people, asking God for forgiveness of your sins, recognizing that you sin and that other people sin, but you have to forgive them as well. So I think that this is an image of Christian forgiveness. That's why. Now remember that the entire thing happens within the framework of a medieval ballad, a medieval worldview, right? And this doesn't. This film is a modern film where people are trying to deal with existential and theological questions in a modern setting. But, I think, and people laughed at this moment in the film too, and I really understand it. Thomas has just been unutterably cruel to her, right? You disgust me. I don't love you. You try to be my wife. You could never be my wife. Shut up. I don't want to hear it anymore. No. He walks out in the hallway, stands there, and he says, would you come with me to, and he was just like, no. And she says, of course she's going to come. And so there's this part of this cycle as well where there's cruelty followed by, forgiveness. You could maybe call it that. Yeah. She said, pardon?
If I can
Twice, yeah.
feel any interpretation.
I'm sorry.
It's
We'll
almost
go
as if
back to
Bergman is
that.
saying,
I'm sorry. I'm getting, okay, come on.
to the extent that I can get any clear interpretation, which is just a guess, it's almost as if, I don't know if Bergman is even saying it, but what he's showing is that there's no answer, in a sense, because he went through love, and one of the most telling incidents in the film to me, and it had to be there for a purpose, was he told Martha, Erickson told Martha, why do you keep mimicking my wife? What a parody. And then she says this absolutely amazing line, I didn't even know your wife.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's clearly something within him, nothing
Yes.
to do with anything she did.
Yeah.
That's clearly we're supposed to think that. And presumably the reason is he was thinking of love as perhaps a saving grace, but then he lost that and he had to keep his love up. I think he maybe just had to maintain it. But then and in fact, that was reinforced by when the organist came in toward the end and told Martha, you should have known his wife. She was really bad. We never find out exactly what he was implying exactly. I can only guess. But whatever he meant, she wasn't much, is what he was saying. And so either Erickson was misled or it's just that something within him. And he sort of was losing that, and he of course lost, according, if you followed what the church helper was saying to him later, it wasn't even physical suffering. It's almost as if this is the ultimate existential message, I think, which is there's nothing you can put your hands on and grasp. Nothing will give you salvation of any kind. So in a way, I have no idea what Bergman believed. Personally, after seeing all these films, I think he was thinking about it and demonstrating it in various ways, what the questions were. I don't even know if there was an answer, but to me it was like he was almost saying, well, there is nothing. Maybe as you pointed out, and that was useful, sort of just human help for each other, like at the end.
Okay.
No real clear abstract theological message.
Yeah, thank you. I'm glad you brought it up. Okay, so that line is a very important line because, as you say, it shows that what Thomas sees in both women, probably both his wife and in Martha, is a projection of something, right? And there's a way in which he makes an idol of his dead wife. You know, he has those pictures that he takes out of her. And it's kind of funny. So in Sweden, across her head, there's this word. Did you notice that? It says proof, right? So these pictures are the proofs. They're like before you get the actual photographs. So they're like these. They're sort of drafts or suggestions of something. They're not the actual photograph, it's not what was finally chosen as the photograph. So he's even looking at photographs that are just proofs. Plus, the writing across her head sort of reminds us of the eczema that Marta suffers from. She has this skin disease that ultimately gets up into her head, into her face. So I do think that there is this weird overlay in Thomas's imagination of the two women, and that he projects this onto Marta, and also that it is an ideal that he is trying to worship, that probably even when his wife was still alive, that she wasn't the real woman. Probably we don't know what was wrong with his wife. I mean, the organist is as a figure is sort of I would say he's kind of a sensualist. He's the musician. He's definitely drunk in that last scene. He's drunk, but he's kind of intimating that maybe the wife cheated on the pastor. I mean, that's what I was sort of getting out of it. She was not as good a wife to him as he ended up being a husband to her. The secular truth teller, yes. We have the religious truth teller and the secular truth teller in the film. Yeah, go ahead.
Me?
Yes, you have the mic.
Okay. I have a confession. I am a church organist.
Oh.
And we have a peculiar relationship to the pastors. We do listen to their sermons. I saw this film when I was first, a teenager, and thought I understood something about it, and then now, having lost 2 wives in the last year.
Oh, wow.
2.
Yeah.
My first wife and the mother of my daughter passed away 4 weeks ago, and my wife of 22 years passed away last November. So, to me it's a story of grief. I don't know whether, and everybody, and of course the organist is going to say, oh, she wasn't that great. Nobody knows how. He obviously loved her dearly. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And no matter how much Marta throws herself at him, because he can't respond to it. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible suffering.
Yeah.
Not to be able, and it brings out all of his and he can't, and of course she's saying, oh, you can't make it on your own. You have to marry me. She says that so many times. Yeah. And it's a commonplace to say that someone who's going through grief can't really share it with anyone else. Really, it's such a personal experience, and it seems to me that this film just totally nails that experience when he looks at the pictures, and you can only imagine what their life was. We'll never know what that is, just as no one will ever know what anyone else's experience of love really is.
Yeah,
it's
okay,
so personal.
this is a good point. And it's certainly the case that he's still mourning his wife. If we bring it back into a realm of, how Freud writes about mourning and melancholy, okay? And he distinguishes between mourning and melancholy. And one of the issues is that a person who's grieving can create a kind of an idol of the beloved, and then uphold that idol and not be able to relinquish it, right? And so there's a question as to where he is in this process, but it's possible that the way in which he's created an idol of his wife, who is not a goddess, and this is what the organist is getting at. None of us is, though, right? So, and you're quite right that no one knows what's going on within a relationship. And for us in the film, the relationship that we witness, where we get a lot of information, is the relationship between Thomas and Marta. She's called Martha in English, and nevertheless, I don't think we really understand that relationship at all. I mean, we're watching it, we're looking at it, they're talking to each other. It looks like, wow, it looks really painful. You know, it's very, very intense, and she's pouring her heart out, and she's kind of clinging to him. As a woman, when I watch that, it makes me very uncomfortable. It's like, he doesn't love you. Walk away. Walk away. Doesn't adore you. Walk away. You know, but yeah, it makes you uncomfortable as a man too. Okay, good. But when I say that, I'm speaking out of my own position, and I can't. And this is what your comment is getting at. We can't stand in the position of other people in their relationships with each other. We don't have access to that. We can watch it, and it can look horrifying, and many of us have watched Friends. You're like, really? No, don't, no. But you really don't know. And so I think that's one of the things he's interested in. I have to let other people speak. We can talk later. Okay, thank you. Yeah, go up. You can go up here. Yeah. Okay.
Can you hear me? Is it working?
Thank you for your comments. Yeah.
Okay. What I got from this, and I think this is what Bergman intended, everybody in the movie was working out their own things. Everyone. And the priest was about as cold as you could get. I mean, and still be alive.
Yeah.
And I think Bergman intended that. When the poor guy came to him, you know, the priest just went into his own thing.
Well, yeah, that's a kind of a horrifying scene.
No, but he was avoiding something. He wasn't just talking about himself. He was avoiding the tragedy of this man that came to him.
Yeah.
And that's all he could do. And his wife probably committed suicide, as far as you know.
Yeah.
It's to get away from him. No, I mean,
yeah, I understand what you're saying.
I think it could be
yeah.
that. Because everyone in this movie, and then the only person that felt that the priest even felt like he was. I mean, his acting was acting. He was just acting the priest.
Yes.
And I didn't find him to be. I mean, that was existential, but his tragedy was not. I mean, his sadness was not existential. It was just almost manipulative. Wow. Anyway, I thought it was brilliant, but that's my hit on it.
Well, okay, so one of the things that you said that I think is very interesting. I mean, you said a number of interesting things, but one of the things that I brought home a lot to my students in the class is that Bergman is very interested in performance. And this is obviously a film about performance. The man is performing the role of a believer. He's performing the role of a priest. He's performing the role of someone who's a counselor to his community. And he's definitely not those things. He can't really fulfill that role. And there's a moment when he's in the car with Marta where where they're waiting for the train to go by. Yeah. And he said, my mother and father wanted me to be a pastor. And so it doesn't arise out of a conviction or faith that he himself feels. And so he's trying to bring this across through sheer performance. And the ritual actually, and I find this very interesting about the film, the ritual lends itself to performance. That's what you do. You have your lines. You're not speaking out of your own position, right? You're speaking in a role. And those lines are always the same lines as if this were a play. It's the Passion Play, right? To the Last Supper. And so the priest is an actor, but the problem is that in the role that he's supposed to play, he's supposed to make connection. And that the scene that you referenced is a very horrifying scene. And Bergman films it in a very interesting way at a certain point also. You can see that the priest, actually, I think there's a moment where his mask has fallen and he goes, please don't go. Let me just talk to you let's just talk to each other for a few more minutes. And you can see that he understands that he's supposed to try to make connection with the person. But the only way that he can figure out how to connect with the person is to talk about himself. He can't relate to what the other person's fears are. And the other person, I mean, what we recognize in the Max von Sydow character, because that is, of course, Max von Sydow, what we recognize in him is deep, deep depression. Where we have to let someone else talk. We could talk later, but I can't, I need to sort of let the conversation flow. But thank you for your comments, because I think you're pointing to a very interesting thing about the priest and about the whole role of the church. So one of the issues is what role does the church actually play? What does the recreation or the sort of performance of this ritual, repeated performance of this ritual, what is that supposed to actually do for people? Can that even be used to reach another person? And then the priest sort of stepping outside and trying to reach the other person. I mean, one of the ways that Bergman films this is, you remember that he's filming Max von Sydow face on, while Max von Sydow is listening to the priest whose back is turned to him, and the priest is looking out the window, and the priest is basically saying, we all basically should kill ourselves. Right? I mean, essentially, that's what he's saying, right? And, right, there's no meaning in life. And you can almost see the man decide to commit suicide, right? It doesn't come as a big shock, I don't think, to anybody that he has committed suicide. So I don't think you can necessarily lay that entirely at the priest's door, because he's trying to pastor a deeply depressed person. But certainly we see that there's no real connection or empathy there. Yeah, it's kind of devastating. I have someone there.
Yeah. For me, one of the key moments is, in terms of reading the film, is when the priest walks into the church and he's blocking the light of the sun.
Yeah.
And then he stumbles.
Yeah.
And reveals the light.
Mm-hmm. It comes through the window.
It comes through the windows. And it's like this, for me, that's a real central moment. And something about how truth is revealed in our human stumbling, or the truth of God is revealed in the human stumbling, or the humbling of the human. Only that's where the God's light is revealed. And Bergman, as a director, it seems he loves to humiliate or to humble.
Yeah,
I mean, that's something that he's especially good at, and he loves to get a close-up of the face of the one. We saw this with Marta. Yeah. That close-up and the humiliation, the humbling of the person. Anyways.
Yeah, but you were associating that humbling with a potential access to the divine. Yeah. And I think that's an interesting point, and I think that you do actually see that in this film. I just have to give a sort of anecdotal story about this, where when they made this film, Sven Nykvist, the cameraman, and Bergman went through the church with a light meter. And they read the light coming into the church at different times of day so that they would know where the light would fall when it came through the windows. The light is natural light for the most part. There's some false light, but it's mostly natural light. And so when these moments come through where the light comes in the window like that, they timed that so that it would do that, right? Obviously. And there's another moment like that where he has just sent, the Max von Sydow character has just left, going to go commit suicide. And Thomas is left there by himself, kind of contemplating his failure to reach this other person. And he's standing at the window, and the light suddenly comes into the window, and suddenly his face is suffused with light, and you have this very strong lighting that happens in that moment. It's quite striking, and he doesn't seem to notice it. And that's one of the things that I think is kind of interesting too, is when I too think that there might be a message about the intervention of light or the potential for the presence of the divine, but nobody seems to notice it. and so they're kind of left stumbling around, right? So yeah, I also like the moment where Marta has just been deeply, deeply humiliated by him, and she's crying. She takes her glasses off and she rubs her eyes, and he says, "Stop rubbing your eyes." And she goes, "It's kind of nice because I can't see you. You look like a big white blob," right? So this idea of not having to actually confront what is going on, I think is kind of an interesting moment too. There's another person who has a microphone back there.
Why do you think Bergman makes Thomas so unappealing, such a repugnant
You're not the
character?
only one in the audience who didn't like him. Yeah. Why does he make him so repugnant? And I think, yeah, I mean, he definitely wants to create someone like that. I mean, I think that if we think about what the role of the priest is supposed to be, I mean, from the very moment, and I think this goes back to your comment, from the very moment we encounter him conducting the service, you have a sense of this person who's absolutely closed to other people, right? And he's mouthing all these words, he's mouthing all of these ritual phrases that are supposed to be about, let's, join in God's communion, and so on and so forth. But it's so obvious that none of this reaches the interior of this man. So I think what Bergman is interested in is, okay, there's a term that's taken from philosophy and linguistics called speech acts. I don't know if you guys are familiar with speech acts. Acts, A-C-T-S, acts. A speech act is when someone does something with words that makes something happen in the world. Okay? So an example is, I now declare you man and wife. Okay? That's a speech act. Or when a judge pronounces a sentence, I sentence you to blah blah. Okay, that's a speech act. That when that thing is said, the thing happens. Ritual practices are speech acts. When the priest says these things about the bread and the wine, that's supposed to recreate. That's supposed to bring down the Holy Spirit. Lutherans don't believe in transubstantiation. They don't believe that it's actually the body and blood of Christ, but they do believe that the Holy Spirit transcends at that, or descends at that moment, right? So one of the questions is, does this ritual practice actually do anything? And I mean, so especially if there's somebody up there mouthing the words who doesn't believe in them, what if you don't believe it when you say these things, right? So what does that mean in the context of the ritual? I think that what's kind of interesting is that Bergman always tries to show different people in the frame. It's not just one message, it's not just one person. So when you look at the communicants sitting, at the railing, you don't know them yet. You're going to find out who they are. But you've got an atheist. You've got a deeply pious man, the man who has a hunchback. You have a man in total dark despair who really can't be reached by God. You have his wife, who is really a pragmatist. She came to church that day because she's looking for counseling, right? She doesn't really, it's not God. It's like, he needs to talk to somebody. He won't talk to me, right? So she's a pragmatist, and then you have this elderly lady who totally is into it. It's like when she gets the body and blood, it's like, yes, she believes, right? So you see different people in the frame. So the issue is, it's like, maybe this person who doesn't believe anything can still be a lightning rod for this power that transcends who he is. But he certainly is not going to be a pragmatic help. He's not going to be able to help the depressed person. He's not going to serve as a counselor. But maybe the ritual practice. Remember when I was introducing the film and Bergman's dad, who is actually a really cold person, also that one of you mentioned this is probably Bergman's dad. Bergman's dad is a very cold person, also mean and kind of angry. It's like, you always hold your service. You always hold the service. Even if there are only 2 people in the church, And those of you who are familiar with scripture, which you kind of have to be if you're a Bergman scholar, yeah, you better be. It's whenever, how many of us are gathered in his name? 2. That's how many it takes to make a service. That's how many it takes to make the ritual happen. 2 people. Okay. So he's playing with that a little bit at the end. Yeah. So why does he make him so awful? Can an awful person be that person? Can an awful person do that? It's kind of an interesting question. Yeah. Yeah, I have a couple people. One more. I actually have just 1 more minute left, so I have 1 more person. Go ahead.
Oh, I have
You're the
mic.
last person, so make it good.
Me.
Sorry.
Well, I hope it's not a waste because it was just going to sort of be a reiteration of things that have already been said. But I think I think the main theme that I enjoyed about the film was he has 2, like there's this binary dynamic in it where you have one leitmotif, which is the complexity of human mourning and how dynamic grief and darkness could be per character. Mm-hmm. And then you have this coping mechanism that has been instilled in everybody's life, which is church. And as you said, it's a really ritualistic, simple way to go about your day-to-day or the larger griefs of mourning for a lost loved one or whatever it is. But yeah, it's almost, to me, it was almost like incorporating a rule for a hardship. Like someone could use dialectic behavioral therapy, which has these very specific steps in how to go about it or whatever. Anyway, that's
it. I mean, and the question is whether it doesn't work for everybody, right? And not everybody is in the church. So one of the points of the film too is how few people in a secular world. So Sweden is now a secular environment. Once upon a time, everybody in the village would go to church. And if you didn't go to church, they'd put you in stocks. Okay, so once upon a time, everybody was in that church, and the church was full. But now Sweden is secular, and it's only the people who elect to be there for some reason, right? And so the question, and then the question really arises, why do people go there? Before, when everybody had to go, it's because everybody had to go. Yeah, it's just like you had to be there or else, right? But now in a secular world, it's like, okay, there are 4 or 5 people sitting there. They must have a reason to be there. I mean, one of my favorite things in the opening scene, which I think a lot of you enjoyed, was the little girl who's being trained to go to church. Her mother says, I don't even know if they translate it. It's like, keep your eyes to the front. Keep your eyes on the front. This girl is just like, oh my God, and she's got her teddy bear. And at one point she's licking the pew. Fortunately, her mother or his grandmother, whoever it is, didn't see that. But what that illustrated for me, I mean, the presence of the child is the question of training of children in this ritual practice and where we are as a secular culture in training children. There's another moment in the film that involves a child in the school where the boy shows up with his dog. Bergman likes dogs and horses. Anyway, he shows up with his dog, and the pastor's trying to make small talk. He's not very good, not surprisingly, with the child like, so, whose boy are you? Oh, what's your dog's name? That kind of adult conversation with a child that doesn't really go anywhere. And then he asks the child, oh, so are you going to go to confirmation classes like your brother? It used to be, once upon a time, everybody in Sweden, every single body did confirmation. And you went and you got confirmed when you were 14, 15 years old. But then it became elective. And then it was a question of, well, are you going to do that? If you're a social democrat, do you make your child do that? If you're a communist, no, not if you're communist. So even the child was deciding right? He says, "Are you going to do it?" No. Why not? I don't know. Well, I know, because he doesn't believe in it, right? So children are now living. So what's going to happen to the community of belief in an age where the community of belief is elective? It's totally elective who wants to go and who doesn't want to go. I have to cut us off. I'm sorry that I had to cut off people today, but sometimes if there are more people that want to talk, and I can't let you hold on to the microphone, so we have to have a dialogue with other people. But thank you.